11:22 a.m. here, United States East Coast, coming to you from the heart of Pineland in Maine. I am your host, Tom Kaczynski. Welcome to the show here. Thank you for tuning in to Sunshine in Pineland. I have to forgive me, I got this one little dingle on my nose, but what are you going to do? It's just a little clot. All right,
Huh?
so, no, just a little thing. I was noticing the thing on my
Don't
nose.
ask you why you're bleeding.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm bleeding. I must have somehow scratched it doing something, but I'm not really sure what. In any case, you can hear Dana here. She's saying hi, and we've got a couple Milfleur de Clays here with us. Actually got three. One had an injury. We're hoping she recovers. We didn't think she'd make it through the night, but it's looking a little more optimistic. I'd say she's in, would you say critical condition, or would you say she's in, what's the one that's above stable, but not as bad as critical? Severe or something? In any case.
There isn't.
All right. Well, she's still
This is
touch
what
and
they
go.
look like.
She's still touch and go. But yeah, well, this is the little ruse, so you can say hi to him. This is one of the Milfleur de Clays. Literally, I think if I'm not mistaken, we'll see if my French holds up. But 1,000 flowers. And I think the clay is fall, but it might be a region. I'm not 100% sure on that. Not really important, but welcome to the show. Glad to be back with you. In case any of you had any, yeah, hey. In case any of you had a doubt, I'm sorry that I was not broadcasting last week. That was not my decision. YouTube decided to hit me with a medical misinformation strike for daring to question the wisdom of Tedros, the WHO director. So we're not going to do that again, but you do know you can certainly go find information on that. And if you ever want to hear information or you wonder where we've disappeared to, you can do two things. Number one, check out t.me/Atlantic Homeland, where I will be over on Telegram telling you, the story behind the story. And if I go silent for about a week and you're really not sure, go check the last posted video. We will leave posted messages to inform you that the channel has been put on temporary hiatus. One of the more newsome things beyond the shutdowns YouTube does to a channel like that is they do not put up a note that the broadcaster is involuntarily being put in the sin bin. Now, to be 100% honest with you, I don't regret sharing information with you, and I will let you determine how valid you consider it or don't consider it. And I would just say that those ideas which you're not allowed to hear and not allowed to express are often the ones that are most meaningful. But I want to thank those of you who were with us for service on Sunday. And I want to add one point that I didn't get to do, which was going to be sort of my Sunday conclusion of this, is that this system we're talking about of the inclusion of technology into biology is coming upon us very quickly, and we're seeing the economic hints of this coming. Just this week in Israel, they were reporting that we are now seeing where they're limiting the amount of money you can use towards a purchase. Literally, you can't make purchases beyond a certain dollar amount. And this fits into the larger agenda that we've been speculating, where we expect to see a credit score going forward that will not allow people to buy things beyond a certain amount. And, if you want, you're curious, check out a website that's been drawing some attention, not as much this week as last week, although I do think that there is some interesting evidence behind it, called Oculum Labs, if you want to look into potential implications of a social credit score and what is being speculated is coming near in the offing. So we're going to cover that much more in the days and weeks ahead, but today we're going to jump to a different line of thought, and I'm going to go into talking about issues of wars that look like they could potentially break out. One of the things that we've been witnessing across the world is a continuing breakdown of the economic systems, and we've seen that the U.S. banking system, for instance, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors decided they were going to raise the lending rate another 75 basis points, or 0.75% interest on the interloan bank rates, called the discount rate. And why would they do this is, one, is it tightens the money supply, so there's less money out there, because technically the way they do this is they buy dollars back, but it also makes the dollar more valuable, which makes things cost more in this country, which in theory was designed to stop inflation, which is the runaway spending. But it's kind of weird to say runaway spending when the recession we are all witnessing, and that some people are starting to now have the gumption to call it depression, is it becoming a major problem. Not only are we seeing prices run away, good to see you, Brenda, Lord's blessing upon you, but we also are seeing that the availability of supplies continues to dwindle, and we're starting to see major losses in jobs, both in terms of actual jobs and in terms of the hours available to people. So despite the fact everyone says they're now hiring, good luck going to find a job these days, especially one worth having. So as that's happening, we're seeing predictable outcomes, crash of the U.S. housing market, which will lead to a crash in the U.S. what should I say, the construction market, we also are seeing the slow, inexorable, but somewhat inevitable march to a rail strike, which will shut down the energy supplies throughout this country, as well as that being, should I say, in California especially, but that's really relevant because Long Beach is where 40% of the imported supplies come into this country. We are seeing the imposition of new rules about emissions that are making it impossible for individual carriers to go in there. At the same time that we are seeing logjam congestion, it's now getting back to rates that have been unseen basically in the history of the modern shipping industry. So what we're to put it in aggregate, we are heading towards a situation where the housing market is slumping, the job market is slumping, logistics through rail is becoming a major problem, and we are going to see a logistic problem with the ports as well. Not to mention that the only reason the oil price is staying down is because A, the economy is destroying itself to some extent, and B, because we are depleting our strategic reserve at a critical time. So at the same time that's happening in China, they are having bank runs where the housing market's starting to collapse. They are the state-run industries that have been going forward and being basically following the Chinese bargain, which was we provide jobs and infrastructure whether they're wanted or needed or not, are not working nearly as well during the zero COVID lockdown policies that they're pursuing there. And their economy being in such trouble, you see, as you saw out of the Great Depression, the wars and rumors of wars are going up to a fever pitch. So we've got two different situations we're going to take a look at today. We're going to be looking at what's happening in China, and we're going to be looking at what's happening in Serbia. And both of these have the potential to start a major conflict. So just give me 1 second here to bring up the YouTube feed because I want to share the articles with you. We're going to read some articles today, and I'm going to let you know where there are problems that could become a major issue. And we will start with, let's start with China. Okay, so a lot of people have been talking about a question whether Speaker Nancy Pelosi is on her way to Taiwan to visit with the government there. And just so you understand, for years, the United States has practiced, since Nixon and Kissinger's trip over there, has practiced this sort of sleight of hand considered the one China policy. Prior to, what was it, I want to say 71? Sometime in the early 70s in any case. What happened was that the permanent seat at the United Nations, which belonged then to the Republic of China, which is the government of Taiwan, which is actually, if you go back, the legitimate government of China from which the People's Republic of China broke away, at least as these things are accounted in diplomatic terms. Obviously, the PRC runs the joint over there. What ended up happening was that out of this evolved the idea that that seat would be transferred to the People's Republic of China as a way of peace, and it was also a way of potentially, at the time, setting China against Russia, so as an ally to the U.S., and it was about that time that we saw American capital begin going over there to fund the rise of the dragon, such as it was. But as part of that, there was an understanding that Taiwan was an integral province of China, and even though it was in a breakaway status, that it would not be recognized as a sovereign nation at this point, which is why you see weird things. Like at the Olympics, they call it the Chinese Autonomous Province of Taipei, because you're not allowed to say that there's two Chinas, even though Taiwan functionally has been independent for many years. And in fact, I don't remember the name of the act. I think it's called the Bird Act, if I remember right. Some people suggest it requires the United States to defend Taiwan in the invasion, if an invasion was conducted by China. We'll find out if it happens, if it goes that way. But in any case, it's something that a lot of people look at because we are their primary arms dealer. And it's not even an abstract issue at this point because the vast majority of the semiconductors and the chips we require for our high technology now come out of Taiwan. So if Taiwan falls, we're going to see a setback of 5 to 10 years in technology. So it's not as simple as saying, hey, we can just let this go. That's why you saw the recently passed CHIPS Act in the Congress. But it's going to take many years to get caught up on that level, even if we have the technology, the infrastructure just isn't there, and as well as issues with the supply chains are set. So we'll see how that works out. But what it does mean is that China considers Taiwan to be an integral province, and they are saying that if Nancy Pelosi were to fly to Taiwan, then there may be an interception by a PLA Air Force, which I know sounds weird to call it the People's Liberation Army Air Force, but they do that in China. Maybe it sounds better in Chinese, I don't know. That they would potentially intercept that flight, they would potentially divert that flight, and failing other things, the threat has been made that, in fact, that flight could get shot down. Now, if it does work out, and I'm not saying China would do this, but they could do this, that they shoot down Nancy Pelosi's plane, then then the odds of us entering World War III become considerable. While I'm sure there are many Republicans that would view this as no potential loss, and certainly I'm not one to speak for the well-being of the speaker and her terrible ideas and abhorrent, alcohol-ridden leadership. What I would say is that in terms of a casus belli or an international view of war, this would be seen by both sides as sufficient to cause a war. So we didn't know if that was going to happen. The suggestion had been, this rumor had been floating around, and it was something that people were discounting. Early this morning, a Taiwanese news source broke the story that this was going to happen, and we've had confirmation in the last about 90 minutes that confirms that Speaker Pelosi is scheduled to be in Taiwan, and she is technically the third highest member of the American government, as these things are appointed, thanks to, I want to say it's the 22nd Amendment, that is going to be traveling to Taipei. So let's start. I want to read a little story here real fast. We're going to do this is from Bloomberg, just to give you the details, but I'm trying to give you context around the details, and we'll talk about war implications if it comes to that. But this way, I won't be accused of putting fake news out there. We'll use nice, plain, acceptable sources, so that way the algorithm will leave me alone for a little while, and that's helpful, and we'll give it information. So Pelosi is to visit Taiwan tomorrow, Liberty Times plans. The U.S. Speaker would be the first since Gingrich to visit the island, so this has happened before. Of course, China wasn't as strong back then, but you'll remember, actually, when Clinton was president, how there was a tense, I think there was a hostage standoff where some Americans were taken hostage, if I remember right, in the early to mid-90s. See if anyone else can remember. But the trip would come after Biden and Xi had a tense call last week. This is by Bill Lee House and Jenny Leonard at Bloomberg.com, published today at... it's updated actually at 10:26 a.m., so within the last hour. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is expected to visit Taiwan on Tuesday, defying Chinese authorities who have warned of consequences if the trip takes place, the Liberty Times reported, citing people familiar with her plans. It would be a landmark move by a U.S. official and raise the risk of military confrontation, given China views Taiwan as its territory. Pelosi would become the first sitting speaker since Newt Gingrich to go to the democratically ruled island in 25 years. The Liberty Times is one of Taiwan's pro-ruling party newspapers. Just to give you a little background, the people who were running Taiwan for a long time were called the Kuomintang, and that was Chiang Kai-shek's movement. Apparently, they were a bunch of military warlords, which kind of sounds like our own military-industrial complex, but now Taiwan has a relatively diverse diplomatic infrastructure, but in reality, they can't survive without the U.S. protecting them. And I will say that Taiwan is promised, your mad dog theory of small states, if in fact that they get invaded by China, they're going to blow up the Three Gorges Dam. So imagine the Hoover Dam, except with 10 million people down water of it in that valley growing rice. Not a great thing, but this is what's been promised, and this is what we're going to see. Hey, Tim, thank you for inviting me back, welcoming back. I'm glad to be back. I didn't want to be away, but I've been away, and I'm glad to be back with you all. Thank you guys who have been supporting the program, as always. Actually, it was not wasted time. Just to tell you, I'm working on a new book, Behold the Beast System. You're going to like it. If you liked last week's episodes, the previous week, you're really going to like it. We'll get more into that later. We also have a Mille de Fleur de Clay rooster here who's helping. Mille de Fleur de Clay? Yeah, and
what
anyway.
The world
and I've got a fly on my ankle and I can't get to it. Okay, there, I can cross my legs. Okay.
Do you want me to smack you with the zappy racket?
No, I don't want it to be zapped with this zapped. No, I don't need to be zapped today. Okay, so let's continue. Chinese media outlets, including the Communist Party's Global Times, have suggested the People's Liberation Army would make an aggressive response to a Pelosi trip, possibly by sending warplanes right over the island. Taiwan would then need to decide whether to shoot them down, a move that could trigger a wider military conflict. And keep in mind, there's a suggestion that Beijing wants this conflict, and they think they can have a war with China can have a war with Taiwan and win. And given the pathetic state of the American military, thanks to woke ideologies, poor Marxist leadership, and the removal of many patriotic Americans whose only crime was showing good sense about their medical protectiveness, they've never been a time when it's more likely, especially if they have hypersonic, missiles. Yeah. Someone did say rooster. We got a cockerel running around up here. I like that word better. But anyway, yeah, cockerel. Let's see. So Taiwan would then need to decide whether to shoot them down, a move that could trigger a wider military conflict. Beijing has flagged other options for retaliation, including trade penalties, and has a history of squeezing Taiwan economically. One of the things that they also do is they have an option. A lot of states do this, but China specifically has this, where they may choose to nationalize their. They have a big fleet of ferries, basically, that move goods back and forth between the mainland and the island, as well as to other sites. And the thought is many of these might be converted to military landing vehicles for certain advanced forces. And we've seen the requisition of at least three of these, if you're to believe Popular Preparedness. Steve Poplar usually does a good job over there. And I think that's a reasonable thing because this has been talked about for some time. And we'll get into what Chinese response is, but I did want to share that because that was just breaking this morning. The Liberty Times reported that Pelosi was expected to see lawmakers in Taipei, that's their capital, on Wednesday. It made no mention of a potential meeting with President Tsai Ing-wen. The Wall Street Journal also reported that Pelosi plans to visit Taiwan and meet government officials, citing people familiar with the matter. Thank you, Rooster. I appreciate that. Good morning to you, too. While the U.S. scrapped its mutual defense treaty with Taiwan after establishing diplomatic ties with Beijing in 1979, China must weigh the possibility that America and its allies in the region would get drawn in militarily. Biden said in May that Washington would intervene to defend Taiwan in any attack from China, although the White House later clarified he meant the U.S. would provide military weapons in accordance with existing agreements. And this is Biden's new favorite thing, that in his addled senility, whether it's acting or real, that he lets go what the plan is. And it makes sense. America has to fight for Taiwan if it wants to keep the semiconductors coming, which it does, because while you and I might survive without it, the military-industrial complex would not. And they are not going to let that go. They'll sacrifice as many of us as they need to make sure that the war machine keeps rolling. Anyway, despite that risk, U.S. lawmakers from both parties have expressed support for Pelosi's trip, arguing it's important the top leader in Congress doesn't cave to pressure from Beijing. If we can allow the Chinese to dictate who can visit Taiwan and who cannot, then we have already ceded Taiwan to the Chinese, said Senate Foreign Relations Chair Bob Menendez, a New Jersey Democrat who made his own trip to Taiwan in April. Visits by lower-level U.S. lawmakers have also prompted military responses by China. Last November, Chinese warplanes flew around the east side of the island after a visit by a U.S. congressional delegation. Could you hand me the racket, dear?
What?
Could you hand me the racket and turn it on? The last major crisis in Taiwan came in 1995-96 when China lobbed missiles into the sea near the ports, and then President Bill Clinton sent 2 aircraft battle carrier groups to the area. Gingrich visited both Taiwan and China a year after that episode, telling Beijing the U.S. would defend the island. Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian made clear at a Monday news briefing, however, that Pelosi's stature as the number 3 official in the U.S. made her trip highly sensitive, reiterating that the army won't sit idly by. So China is posturing pretty hard, and, of course they always do that, which gives us the intention. Sometimes we look at that and say, well, we don't have to take them too seriously, because it's just China, foaming at the mouth. But on the other hand, in a time when they have a lot of domestic problems, when there's questions of the leadership structure in that country, when we're not 100% certain how well their economy is holding up, in fact, their growth rate, their GDP, was only at plus 0.4%, which, given that the U.S. has had 2 down quarters, which by any reasonable definition was a recession, although that was redefined when it happened, funny story, and given that China's infamous for inflating their numbers, the truth is the Chinese economy may be in major trouble. Remember, this was an economy based heavily on exports, and if goods aren't moving, neither are the Chinese people. Now, they have a social credit score system, the thing we're worried about, that tends to negate some of that opposition, and you saw that in the integration of Hong Kong, but they probably are looking for something else for people to be worried about, and that could be a war. Okay. So, I'm going to bring up another piece here. This is from the South China Morning Post, which is out of Hong Kong, and it will offer a view that is closer to what we're going to see coming out of the Chinese, the government here. Now, South China Morning Post used to be a little more balanced, but as Hong Kong has come fuller under the support of China, I think we're going to see this fits a little more what they're saying. So let me just make sure I got this set up in a way where I can actually read it. And this was published by Josephine Ma yesterday at 9 p.m. Local time. China's official media sends indirect warning to Nancy Pelosi over Taiwan visit. Communist mouthpiece repeated Xi Jinping's warning not to play with fire, while other state outlets cited Donald Trump's opposition to any visit. A less measured response came on the tightly controlled internet, with angry calls for direct military action if the U.S. House Speaker visits the island. The official mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party has repeated President Xi Jinping's warning against playing with fire over Taiwan ahead of a possible visit to the island by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The commentary in People's Daily did not mention her by name, while other official outlets refrained from direct attacks on her, but did report warnings by former President Donald Trump against visiting. You know what? This isn't the article I had up before. Where did the one go? Give me a second. I had an article. Oh, here it is. Okay, so let's see. This stupid thing jumped. Okay, that's fine. I meant to read a different article. I apologize. That's true, but this is the one I meant. This was by Laura Zhao. Same thing, South China Morning Post. In China, articles rewrite when you read them so that you get good information. Okay. China puts on show of naval force ahead of Nancy Pelosi's possible Taiwan visit. This is the one I wanted. Beijing announces a live fire exercise in Taiwan Strait and releases footage of operations in the South China Sea. And keep in mind, a live fire exercise can become an invasion in 5 seconds. A visit to the island by the U.S. House Speaker would enrage Beijing. That's going to happen. Nice. And concern is growing that a miscalculation by any party could raise the risk of conflict. The Chinese military is mounting a show of force ahead of U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Asian tour, which could include a visit to Taiwan, as China hardened its posture despite a growing concern that a miscalculation could increase the risk of conflict. It was said it was holding live fire drills in the Taiwan Strait and released footage of a similar exercise in the South China Sea. And if you were to read the rest of this, I'll put the article in here. It's cutting off the bottom behind a paywall, which it wasn't doing before. And like I said, this thing keeps changing on me while I'm reading it. But what the article said, I'll summarize, was that they had closed off the strait. And China asserts that the Strait of Taiwan is territorial waters. Thank you, Philadelphia. Waters of... right? Waters of China, because it says Taiwan is a breakaway province, and therefore the freedom of navigation isn't protected. So every now and then, the U.S. sails a ship through there just to say we don't agree with you. And that often gets very tense, but that's something that happens. There's something called the 8 Mile Line, where China claims all sorts of things, and they basically pissed off everyone in their area. So at the same time that's happening, let's read another piece here. This is from the Korea Herald. And when I say that, what happens with war sometimes is there's miscalculations on all sides. So at the same time that we're seeing China go into live fire exercises, South Korea, U.S., and Japan start Pacific Dragon ballistic missile defense drill this week. Pacific Dragon, that name isn't evocative. Seoul will take a cautious case-by-case approach to gradually expand trilateral military drills by Ji Da-gyum. Okay, and this was published yesterday at, let's see, that's 5:34 in the afternoon, or in the evening, I should say. And one of the things that's happened out of their election, Japan, now that Abe's gone, are using that as justification, and South Korea electing a conservative leader have become much more militarized and are getting ready in expectation for, if not a war, a more vigorous defense being needed for China. But just to give you a little detail about this, South Korea, the United States, and Japan are set to jointly conduct a ballistic missile defense exercise to enhance military interoperability and readiness against escalating threats from North Korea. They didn't say the Pacific Panda Drill. The Pacific Dragon ballistic missile drill, led by the U.S. Pacific Fleet, will be held for 2 weeks between Monday and August 14th off the coast of Hawaii. The South Korean military confirmed on Sunday. A total of 5 countries, South Korea, Australia, Canada, Japan, and the United States, will participate in the multilateral exercise. So this is interesting. They're removing the Japanese and Korean fleets to some extent to be in American waters in defense in Hawaii, which, if you think about it, if you were worried about a fight, the big threat they have, it's called, what do they call it? Anti-air, anti-sea. The theory is that China wants to have enough missiles in its littoral, that's the coastal waters, where they could blow up any ships that are close enough. And so the American fleet, because of the depth of that and the danger of those waters, would have to remain east of Taiwan as a series of operations to have enough time to have missile defense against something, which doesn't even account the possibility of hypersonic defense and whatever missiles the Chinese may have developed on their own or have gotten from their Russian allies. So now the fleet of these countries that would be allied to the United States in a potential conflict is sitting deep in American waters at Hawaii as a standback point. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps not. Something to think about. What's that? Okay, give me a second. I gotta relocate to the other room. 1 sec. Give me 1 sec, guys. Alright, give me 1 second here. Just for those of you who don't,
Sorry.
the wife was about to send me into exile, but we've been redeemed by the wrong number. So, although
Well, there's been somebody from Aspen Dental like calling me repeatedly saying like I owe them like money from Greenville, like, but my name's not William. I'm
Nah.
like, I got the wrong person.
That's true. Dana's name is not William, so all right, that's good. And yeah, I came in here.
Sorry.
It's something that happens from time to time. Not a big deal. I don't want to. You know what? Have you ever? Just as an interjection here, have you ever been waiting for a call from a doctor? We're often in a case like that, and when that call comes, you take it because God knows, otherwise you could be sitting on answering machines for the rest of your life. Okay. So where were we? 5 countries. South Korea's Navy plans to dispatch the 7,600-ton Sejong the Great class Aegis destroyer equipped with SM-2 surface-to-air missiles. The Pacific Dragon exercise aims to improve interoperability and tactical and technical coordination among participants in detecting, tracking, and reporting and assessing ballistic targets. God, you take 1 week off, and I've been quiet and I haven't had to talk. Now I forgot how to do so. It's crazy. Just real fast, Ben, since you're here, I haven't had a chance to check that out yet because I'm busy in writing the book. I will probably do so, but probably not for another week and a half, just because I'm in the middle of writing, and when I'm writing, I'm in total tunnel vision mode. I only come up to do this and feed the wife. All right. During the drill, the 5 countries will practice detecting, tracking, and sharing information on dummy ballistic projectiles which are fired by the U.S. Navy, according to the South Korean military. The U.S. Navy will also intercept the dummy projectiles with guide missiles. And I would imagine, given the money they've been throwing around in Washington, a lot of this is fear about what's happening with the supersonic missiles and the idea of the defense that they are trying to put together, as well as a functional what do they call them, ramjet type engine model. But we are behind in this because our military spends money on gender reassignment surgeries instead of weaponry. Okay. And I'm sure that's lovely. By the way, win for the people. Tavistock Institute of Gender, what was it called? Transformation Change, whatever, was shut down. So that's a win for the many children who have been exploited by that and submitted to a terrible crime, I would say. But not the point of today. So let's continue. Although the Pacific Dragon has been staged every 2 years on the occasion of the U.S.-led biennial Rim of the Pacific, or RIMPAC, exercise, the drill was not open to the public in 2018 and 2020 in order to not provoke North Korea. But South Korea's military confirmation came after the South Korean, U.S., and Japanese defense chiefs met in June and agreed to regularize and publicize trilateral missile defense exercises to deter North Korea's ballistic missile threats. And just for those of you who haven't been paying attention, North Korea regularly chucks up a couple missiles over Japan, which people don't feel very good about, but it happens. All right, so expanding trilateral security cooperation and military exercises is one of the key agenda topics, blah, 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 blah. They want to expand it. We don't need to read every detail of this, but I do want to say this is something that's been ongoing, and it's a big thing to have China, not China, I should say Japan and South Korea work together. They talk about something called the Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultation Group, and a meeting is planned this September. You don't need to know every little detail of this. You just need to know all the missile planning units, defense units, are falling back to Hawaii, practicing for something. At the same time, our speaker is going to Taiwan, and China has its fleet in the ocean. Now, will something result from this? Maybe. I don't think Taiwan wants to advance the issue. But if China wants to pick a war and they want to create a false provocation, if they feel like they're ready, and the suggestion by people who've been studying these things is September to October is the more likely window, they do have an opening to do so now. And whether or not that's a good idea or not, they may reckon that this is an opportunity given the various commitments of the U.S. and the depletion of our military stocks across NATO and allied groups like AUKUS through the support of the Ukrainian regime against the Russians. So, just like in World War II, how there was a Pacific theater and a European theater, let's go back to Europe. Now, you all know what's happening in Ukraine, and basically the super short version is Russia's consolidating what's happening in Donetsk and Luhansk. I believe they've taken control, more or less, except for maybe a couple small holdout areas of those regions, and the push to the Dnieper is on, ongoing efforts in Kharkiv, consolidation in Kherson, and it looks like Russia's trying to make sure that they have complete control by the end of August of those areas of the breakaway republic, republics, including the fact that the breakaway republics are now having relationships with Belarus, and I believe Luhansk is going to be having a vote whether or not they want to be annexed to Russia, much like we saw in Crimea. And given the nature of these votes, we're going to see that will likely go through. At the same time, we're seeing that the Ukrainian government, in their anger, is saying that they will punish any Ukrainian citizens who accept a Russian passport. There is a rumor that's been floating around for some time. Gonzalo Lira, I think, was reporting, if I'm not mistaken, that the Ukrainian chiefs of their military have gone to the Zelensky regime and said, you need to sue for peace in the next 30 days or we will remove your government. And given that Ukraine is a country that's known to have a lot of coups, and given that Zelensky has kind of lost the star off his shine, I think that's not an impossible thing, given that the Russians are now basically just using artillery to level the Ukrainians. And how far they want to go, yeah.
Remember I was telling you yesterday, I got some messages from some Russian sellers that I used on Etsy.
Yes.
Saying that because of PayPal shutting down, well, their SWIFT system and PayPal and everything, they have been banned. Russian sellers have been banned from PayPal.
Just in case you couldn't hear, Dana was saying that Russian sellers on Etsy had been banned as part of it. And this is one thing we've seen.
They don't have any payment.
Correct. Using PayPal, we're seeing them boxed out of the financial process. And turning every Russian into a pariah surely won't make war more likely, right? But yeah, no, it's really sad. And these people have nothing to do for it. They make, I mean, what the woman you work with, what does she make?
Linen
dresses.
Linen dresses. That she's in Bulgaria. But all the Russian shops they all got shut down on Etsy.
So just one more example of the terrible fallout. And the Russians, to their, understandably, are limiting increasingly the taps on Europe, where the energy prices are going through the roof right now, and great economic costs. You know, one of the things that Europe relied upon, the dirty secret of the German industrial might in Europe at this point in history, was that they were getting pretty cheap gas from Russia so they could go ahead with their green energy, because like most people who profess the climate agenda, they were hypocrites, and they were taking gas from other places while saying we're clean at home. So basically, it was the same thing we see a lot of corporations do, which is ruin places where they're not to keep places they are comfy while they make more money. Sort of like Americans do with dollars and, our military-industrial complex. They do with their industry as well in Germany. And these things don't change that much. The same companies are around who've been around the whole time. So, with all that in mind, one of the things that has been interesting is America and the West and NATO have not had a lot of success with their war against Russia. I mean, by any reasonable standard, because BRICS has been growing. That's the potential for an alternate currency. The demand for Russian oil is advancing. In fact, they're scheduled to complete the first complete pipeline, I believe, that goes from Russia, and I think it terminates eventually in Shanghai, where we're going to see a massive move of where that energy is, and a lot of the excess Russian supply has been picked up by the Indians, the supposed Quad allies, who are doing what India traditionally does, which is to follow a third way sort of non-aligned philosophy, which they've been following with the BRICS movement as well. And so we've seen basically Russia's been the beneficiary of this war, not in the type of the Russians who died. I'm sure there have been many servicemen who died in service to them, as well as the many Ukrainians. I'm not trying to argue a side in this conflict, but I'm trying to say that the idea that this is an unending quagmire that Russia cannot extricate itself does not seem necessarily to be accurate. But that being the case, we're seeing another one develop, and this time it's in Serbia, and it's near periphery. So for those of you who don't remember the history of World War I, which oddly enough is never taught because it broke a world that made a lot of sense into a world that did make a lot of sense, but where bankers came out of it with big wins, like you have big institutions formed up so that you would have the ability to have major states be permanently in debt, that you saw the destruction of a lot of the monarchies, and the Christian ones specifically, in Austria, in Russia, and in Prussia, which was Germany, the Holy Alliance, the creation of the State of Israel that came out of that, or I should say the mandate of Palestine that becomes Israel eventually, through the Balfour Declaration, and the inclusion of America into a war that Woodrow Wilson literally campaigned he wouldn't get us into. By the way, when Democrats tell you they are not going to get you into a war, they're going to. Not that Republicans don't. Everyone loves war. War makes people happy because war creates industry, war creates opportunity, war makes you feel like you're a part of something. It's big and it's exciting until it sucks and you lose and people die. And then you think, what the hell did we do that for? It's like drinking too much on a Saturday night, something you probably should avoid. But what ends up happening out of this is that that region in the Balkans has a lot of problems, because basically the short version of the history of it is that Austria ended up fighting the Ottoman Turks for the better part of 500 years over who was going to control that area. And you ended up with different groups that were divided on ethnic and religious loyalties. You could look at, you have the Croats, and to a lesser extent the Slovenians, who are the Catholics over there. You have the Bosnians, who are Muslim. You have the Serbians, who are Orthodox. And you have the breakaway province from Serbia that's recognized as a country by some, but not others, of Kosovo, that primarily, but not completely, has Albanians connected with Serbs, who are mostly Muslim, but some Orthodox. And then the Macedonians, who consist, they're Greek, or at least Macedonian, and they fight. So it's now called North Macedonia because Greek says they're not really. And anyway, so the Balkans are a mess. The Balkans caused World War One when you saw Prince Franz Ferdinand get assassinated. He was the Austrian prince who was in Bosnia, which was part of the Austrian Empire, who was murdered by Gavrilo Princip, if I remember his name right, a Serbian separatist. And what happened is that Austria was going to punish Serbia, which is called NATO in the West, and the Russians said, you're not going to hurt our Orthodox friends. And the Germans told the Russians, you're not going to hurt the Austrians. And then next thing you knew, we were in a world war. So when the Balkans have problems, specifically when Serbia has problems, because you'll remember, some of you will remember, what's his name, Slobodan Milosevic. And one of the roots of a lot of the fighting between the U.S., China, and Russia comes from this period between about 1999 to 2002. At that time, everyone was getting along pretty good in the post-Soviet space. Yeltsin had just left power. Putin was actually looking to join NATO. And even after 9/11, there was a suggestion that we could all get along against, the savages, as you'd put it. Not to insult anyone, but that's how it was looked at. But what happened was that the United States didn't like the Serbian regime that Milosevic had. And I'm not here to go into every detail. And by the way, Gary mentions, and a great point, Howard's open, Scott Howard, our good friend of the program, Mr. Alex Jones himself, Open Society book, gets into that in great detail. It's well worth a read. Definitely that, and the transgender industrial complex. Highly recommend him. He's a really solid guy. I can definitely attest to that, and a friend of the program for sure. So what happens is Milosevic, NATO, which is supposed to be a defensive alliance, decides they want to go get themselves into a war. And they break a province away from Serbia, which pissed the Russians off. And you'll remember at the time an American stealth fighter got shot down, which was like something that didn't happen back then, as well as we accidentally dropped a bomb on the Chinese embassy. Now, I'm sure the Chinese didn't think it was an accident, and I'm actually somewhat sure it wasn't an accident, because we were unhappy about noises that they were making. And if you really want to trace when China and Russia got thrown into the same camp, you could make there are arguments less compelling that could be made than the argument that it was the war in Serbia, which showed that the U.S. was going to use NATO as a hammer, which, by the way, they did after not just Afghanistan, which a lot of people understood, but Iraq, which a lot of people didn't understand, and still to this day don't understand. But people looked the other way. The Russians didn't have the power to do so, and China was more worried about selling goods and building up their own domestic economy. Not that those grievances wouldn't fester. In the meantime, so Serbia has been at the periphery of NATO, and even there's been overtures about the idea that Serbia would eventually join NATO, because ultimately you're surrounded by NATO if you're Serbia, right? You have Bosnia and Croatia on one side, you have Romania and Bulgaria to the other, you have all these, and North Macedonia, which no one even knows is in NATO, recently joined. So you basically have Serbia surrounded, with the exception of Kosovo. And in Kosovo, you have a force of about 4,000 NATO Partnership for Peace, I think is what they call it, forces that are there. They're trying to prevent these things from happening. Now, from the Serbian perspective, because these lines don't make sense, think of like tribal entities in Africa. There's a big chunk of Serbs in Bosnia that are trying to secede and break that state, which is one of the reasons why Bosnia, I believe, is not in NATO, even though they've been a candidate for accession for quite a while, because they don't have frozen conflicts. Think about how Luhansk and Donetsk work in Ukraine, or Transnistria in Moldova, on the Romanian border. The same sort of deal exists within Bosnia and within Kosovo. And for that matter, you could even argue the whole country of Montenegro, which was a Serbian province. And all this was run because you had Serbian leadership under the day. You go back to Marshal Tito and you had Yugoslavia, in a Yugo. Okay, so now that you know all that background, let's get into what's happening in Serbia. And we're going to read this piece is by the Jerusalem Post, and I'm going to give you a lot of background. And this is important because these people have a really bad tendency to get themselves into wars that everyone else gets dragged into. And then being the Balkans, they simply do not care what kind of mess they cause for the rest of us. It happens over and over again. They've done it before. They're going to do it again. And honestly, until either, Austria or the Turks take them back, or maybe the Hungarians, I think it's going to continue. It's just the nature of that area, but we'll get into the details of what's happening right now. And it's important because Russia is not going to back down from backing the Serbians. If NATO does not back down from backing the Bosnians or the Kosovars, there's two separate and related issues here, then what might end up happening is we could very easily see... What the heck is this? Give me a second. Alright, my thing is being messed up. Give me 1 second to bring this back up. Okay, there we go. I don't know why it didn't like when I clicked that link, but I fixed it. Okay. So this piece is by Aaron Reich from the J Post. Kosovo, Serbia, the background, sirens in the Balkans, an explainer. The recent gunfire sirens and border closings between the two Balkan countries have raised alarms. Here is an explainer on the region's complex history. Sirens sounded for 3 hours in the town of Mitrovica in northern Kosovo on Sunday, July 31st, as Serb protesters blocked roads and shot at local authorities in the Balkan country. Kosovar Prime Minister Albin Kurti placed blame on Serbia, its neighbor with whom it has had an often tense and antagonistic relationship over the past several years. And just so you know, NATO carved Kosovo out of Serbia. Okay, they did this. There's no secret about it. This was an offensive war they chose. You can argue that it was justified for peace in Europe, but they did it, and the people who noticed that, that's what the truth is. But what happened exactly? What is the long and complex history of these Balkan nations, and how are Russia and NATO involved? Here's what you need to know. What is Kosovo? Kosovo is a relatively new nation in the Balkans, having declared independence from Serbia in 2008. Its capital city is Pristina. To date, its status as an independent country is disputed, and it does not have unanimous international recognition. Its populace, known as Kosovars or Kosovans, is largely ethnic Albanian, with Serb, Bosniak, and Turkic minorities. And just so you know, Albania is a NATO member, and Albania has a Muslim population, okay? The vast majority of its population identifies as Muslim, and its official languages are Albanian and Serbian. Kosovo's history, like that of the entire Balkan Peninsula, is incredibly complex, featuring a vast number of ethnicities, national identities, religions, and languages that have often been subjugated under the rule of a number of greater imperialistic powers such as the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and later on Yugoslavia. And remember that when the Yugoslavians broke, we're going to talk about that in a second, but much like America, you had a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious empire, and when it broke apart, everyone shot one another, the towns became hell, and people just tried to survive in the country as best they could. Comments on what happens with multiculturalism, something to think for those of us living in the U.S., Canada, and other multicultural countries. What is wrong with the Balkans? To oversimplify a very complex problem, the Balkans are incredibly diverse. I like how, and this is just one of those things, only an Israeli publication can get away with calling diversity a problem. If you or I were to say that, the ADL would be knocking down our doors. In fact, that's happened to me. Anyway, with a great deal of tension over the years between its many ethnic groups, religious groups, and nationalities, this history goes back centuries, but an immediate spark can be seen at the start of World War I, which was preceded by a wave of nationalism in the region against the hegemony of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, prompting a Serbian nationalist to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. I know better than that. I know. The dingo ate my baby. What?
Nothing.
What's that? I'm doing the best I can. Tensions between the many demographics in the Balkans continued to escalate even after World War I and during World War II, periodically flaring up into violence. They continued to boil throughout the Cold War and into the 1990s, which sparked a series of brutal conflicts in the region, particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. You have to forgive me, by the way. I will correct myself if I say something funny. My tongue's a little numb today.
Why don't you try speaking a little slower?
Because I got a lot to read. What is important to understand is that the Balkans is essentially a major meeting point connecting the Muslim, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian worlds. Balkan nations in the former Yugoslavia that are largely Orthodox Christians include Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. The majority Catholic nations are Croatia and Slovenia, while the majority Muslim ones are Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. To complicate matters further, minority populations of each ethnic and religious group can be found across the board. Also, note that despite the Kosovars being largely Albanian, the nation of Albania itself is not part of Yugoslavia. So this was a mess in an empire where in empires, it doesn't matter. For instance, you don't think of what the Hispanic population, let's just use an example, in Las Vegas is versus Boston versus Minneapolis, because it's all part of America, and you just think, oh, those people are in America. But when things fall apart, say America broke into different pieces, you might think about what these differences are. Say there were 6 nations. Let's say Northwest, Southwest, Greater Texas, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the South. You would see these become real problems because there'd be like pockets of people that didn't really make sense, and people would obviously move, but sometimes they don't because they've been there a long time anyway. Imagine that over 400 years. It's like the Balkans. What caused the war in Kosovo? In the late 19th century, Albanians were expelled from areas that would soon be brought into Serbia. After this, many moved to Kosovo, where the conflicts erupted between them and the local Serb population. These tensions and clashes would continue throughout the 20th century, most notably in the many conflicts between 1912 and 1945, with incidents of persecution and crimes against humanity being carried out against both sides. And by the way, all the sides over there did that. In Yugoslavia, after World War II, Albanian nationalists at first faced crackdowns, but slowly tried to achieve new representation and authority as time went on. And just so you remember, Albania was, I think, part of Italy at this time, before World War II, rather. However, in the 1980s, further tensions began to boil between Serbs and Albanians in Kosovo, and more crackdown efforts were launched in the 90s as Serbia sought to protect Serbs and Serbian interests in the area. During the 90s, the Balkans erupted into wars throughout Yugoslavia, itself dissolving into several nations. In particular, the war in Bosnia was especially brutal, with widespread crimes against humanity, including genocide, most notably the horrific events in Srebrenica. These tensions further escalated within Kosovo, which saw the establishment of a Kosovo Liberation Army. By the way, that's a color revolution. A separatist militia that had expressed nationalist goals, at one point even calling for the establishment of a unified nation-state of all Albanian inhabited lands called Greater Albania. And notice that nationalists are cool, except when they're in the Western countries, Try being a nationalist in America, see how you get treated, right? Complicated matters further was the growing KLA arsenal, which itself was fueled by the chaotic outbreak of the Albanian Civil War and the subsequent looting and pilfering of military stockpiles. At that time, the KLA had a poor reputation internationally, with both Yugoslavia, which became Serbia and Montenegro as that split, and the U.S. State Department considering it a terrorist organization. So what happened in the Kosovo War? And Gary writes correctly, I think, the Kosovo army was literally a bunch of gun runners and jihadis, a bunch of scum packed by NATO, and we did bring in, and this was an example of stuff that we saw, going back to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Remember old Osama bin Laden, where we were funding Muslim terrorists to go forward, just like we saw in Ukraine, by the way. They came through the Turks, Syrian fighters, the ISIS folks rebranded, and they were fighting the Russians there. Of course, the Russians had their own Muslim, tribes made fun for them in the Chechens, but this is what happens. We're going back to an era where countries regularly hire mercenaries to fight their war for them. We call them guerrillas and jihadis. They're mercenary groups. And we do that too. We have private military contractors. We just have different ways of putting it. All right. What happened in the Kosovo War? Serbian and Kosovar forces began to clash in the late 90s, leading to considerable fatalities and accusations of atrocities and war crimes, sparking condemnations from Western nations. So basically, Serbia had terrorist groups within there that were working to unseat their state from their perspective, or you could see them as liberators working for their own nationhood, whatever. But NATO decided that they were going to hurt the Serbs, and why they want to hurt the Serbs? Well, because they had always been close to Russia, and they had remembered that this is a long war between the Anglo-Saxon West and the Russian East. And they understand it that way. If you ever want to know, read Katahon or one of the Russian sites. They're very much more honest about it. In the West, we have layers of BS you have to fight through, like ideology. But in the East, especially in Chinese and Russian thinking, they think of civilizations as terms of groups of people, and they think of an orthodox civilization to some extent, and the Russians see themselves as the big brother protecting the Serbs. If you don't understand that, none of this makes sense, and the West knows this, and they use this. In any case, Finally, on March 24th, 1999, NATO intervened with a massive bombing campaign. At the time, the Western military alliance's motivations were described by German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder as such: "We are not going to war, but we are called upon to implement a peaceful solution in Kosovo, including by military means." So, Orwellian speak, right? War is peace, and we're going to bomb the crap out of them until they stop resisting. A NATO spokesperson also described their motivation as Serbs out, peacekeepers in, refugees back. The bombing campaign lasted more than a month and a half until June 10th, longer than expected, as Serbian resistance held out longer than planned. It escalated from simply targeting Yugoslav defenses to striking individual Yugoslav units on the ground. So, just so you understand this, this was an integral part of I should say Serbia at this point. Serbia and Montenegro were still in, I think, a combined entity. And so the West, as a response to this, bombed them until they let Kosovo go, Montenegro became separate, and Serbia was weakened even further. Just so you understand here. Rooster writes, multiculturalism worked just as intended as America. We haven't seen the worst of it yet. Sadly, that's true. Although what's interesting, and if you want to get a laugh, some of you will appreciate this. Tim Pool did a little piece on this. The LA Times is reporting at the frustration of Mexicans, where gringos from California with too much money are coming to their country, making homes unaffordable, and speaking English at every cafe. They're like, maybe they should have helped. What was it? Mujer la pared, right? Build the wall. Um, Life's irony, right? In any case, at one point it seemed NATO troops would mount a ground assault as well, with British and Norwegian special forces both having reportedly entered Kosovo. Meanwhile, Russian troops also entered the country, with Russia being Yugoslavia's ally, and tensions between Russia and NATO forces were apparent during this time. Ultimately, however, it was this NATO effort that essentially ended the war, leading to the signing of the Kumanovo Agreement that saw Yugoslav forces pull out. What has happened since then? A lot. For years, Kosovo had a measure of autonomy while still under Serbian rule. However, talks stalled over what would happen next, boiling over in 2004 in a severe outbreak of interethnic violence. By the way, the reason I give you this deep research on it is because we live in a world where everything is presented as a good guy versus bad guy. And the reality is people have their own truths, their own tribes, and these fights happen. What happens is Western powers, especially, but not exclusively, exploit these existing conflicts to get us into bigger wars or to sell weapons or to accomplish certain ends. So you need to know what's happened to know what's going to happen. Just like those people who think Ukraine was invaded by the terrible Russians and they never did anything wrong. They didn't bomb the people in Donetsk and Luhansk for 8 years, because they're not, or they didn't have a coup there. They don't know their history. And if you don't know your history, you're going to walk into the stupidity, and you need to know that so you avoid that. I know most Pinelanders know that. And if you're new to the channel, thank you for joining us here in Pineland. Thank you for those who support the program. The Venmo CVC PRV, PO Box 343, Eagle Lake, Maine 04739. We need and welcome your support. It allows me to keep doing this. It takes a lot of time to do this. And also, please check out the books over on Amazon. Surviving the Fall of America being the most recent one. I will have a new one up for you in September. Behold the Beast System is going to be a good one. It's probably my best work since coming out of Babylon, from the perspective at looking at what we are going to face going ahead. Surviving the Fall actually does a good job telling you what you need to do now today to prepare, but I'm going to do what you guys love about this program. We're going to look into the future, into a near future, see how that system that's going to hurt us all is going to be put into place, see what we can do to offer resistance potentially between now and then, and why, to be 100% frank with you, it's likely we're going to face this problem, and what we're going to have to do in order to understand and educate others so that we can try to prevent this or survive it as best we can. What is the phrase, turn around is fair play? Yeah, it's, the irony of it is quite rich for the situation with the Californians going everywhere, The refugees who have all the money in the world that nobody wants. And I feel bad because we do have a couple Californians this program is friendly with, but they're the only ones, only honorary Pinelanders like that guy will be permitted to escape the, make it like, what was it, those old Kurt Russell movies, Escape from LA. Anyway. So, attempts by the UN Security Council to intervene were stymied by Russia, which holds veto power as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN, because Moscow would only support an outcome that Serbia and Kosovo would agree upon. But in 2008, the Republic of Kosovo eventually declared independence anyway and is currently recognized by just 97 UN nations, including Israel. Technically, 112 nations have recognized Kosovo, but 15 have withdrawn their recognition. Kosovo is not a member of the United Nations, its independence not being recognized by half of them, notable among them Russia, China, and Serbia. A NATO mission continues to maintain a presence in Kosovo with 3,770 troops. This is like Russia does in Transnistria. What it's called is a tripwire that's designed to keep conflicts frozen, to make sure a presence can be had, and to maintain influence. In this case, for Russia to help Serbia, or to help, in this case, for the U.S. to help Kosovo. Otherwise, Serbia would probably re-annex it. Anyway. Overall, while the situation is much more stable, tensions never truly died out, and there remains a great deal of resentment and antagonism between Kosovo and Serbia. So, what just happened now? On July 31st, sirens blared in Kosovo, and two border crossings with Serbia. Oh, what happened? It's the page. Okay, were closed by police after Serbian protesters reportedly blocked roads and shot at local authorities. The background of this was, of course, rooted in the years of tension and antagonism between the two countries. More immediately, however, it was due to a new rule that anyone with Serbian ID entering Kosovo would need to replace it with a temporary document while in the country. Notably, this rule isn't unprecedented. Serbia has an inverse version for visiting Kosovars. Albania is mostly dirt roads. Yeah, no, the people over there hate each other. Albania is a mess. Albania is basically known for spreading crack and prostitutes. I'm not even joking. It's just one of those things. But another issue was license plates. Ethnic Serbs in Kosovo, with Tirana is the big city, right? With Serbian license plates will be required to change them for Kosovar ones. Currently, some 50,000 Serbs in northern Kosovo still use license plates and documents issued by Serbian authorities, refusing to recognize the Pristina government and its institutions. The ongoing tensions have caused Kosovo to postpone this until September 1st, though documents are already being handed out. So Kosovo is trying to make itself a nation. The Serbs near the border are saying, no, we're part of Serbia. We're just dealing with that until you come in. And so this is sort of the tensions, sort of like we saw in Luhansk and Donetsk. Currently, the border crossings at Bernak and Zherinji remain closed as of August 1st. So how is Russia involved? Russia has always been a long-standing ally of Serbia, even amid its ongoing invasion of Ukraine. This goes back hundreds of years, right? Notably, right before the sirens went off, Serbian politician Vladimir Dukanovic wrote on Twitter that everything seems to me that Serbia will be forced to begin the denazification of the Balkans. Now, keep in mind, this is really interesting. He says, I'd like to be wrong. No, he doesn't. He is using the exact same language that Vladimir Putin used to describe what they were doing in Ukraine. And this is how they view NATO. They view NATO, and this is why the Russians view NATO this way. After World War II, what happened was NATO cut a deal with the German spy apparatus in the East and brought them in as the foundation of what would eventually be the American, British, and German intelligence networks, and that you saw through Operation Paperclip and other sources brought in to the CIA, and why you saw the creation of these independent services through the National Security Act 1947 and in the evolving mission of MI6 through Britain. So there is an argument that you could make that's very defensible from this, but they would say, oh, we were just taking refugees and so did the Russians. Whatever you want to believe. The Russians believe in groups like the Bilderbergs, which is a combination, which is literally founded by an ex-SS guy from Belgium who was royalty to connect the European elites with the American elites, all right? And the British elites as well, because they're kind of in between. And what they did was they put together NATO, and they see that this NATO imperialism was enacted against their Orthodox friends in Serbia, as well as in Romania and Bulgaria and places, because Southern Europe is kind of a mess, Southeastern Europe. Okay. But anyway, this mirrors the rhetoric used by Moscow, which claimed that it wanted to denazify Ukraine shortly before launching its invasion of its post-Soviet neighbor in February. Russia has been vocal about the Kosovar demand for Serbian documents, with Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova, you've heard of her, she's the one talking about Ukraine all the time, saying the plan to require temporary documents for them is a step toward their expulsion from Kosovo. Russia calls on Pristina and the U.S. and the EU behind it to stop provocations and respect the right of Serbs in Kosovo, she said. The leaders of the Kosovars know that the Serbs will not remain indifferent when it comes to a direct attack on their freedoms and deliberately escalate in order to launch a military scenario. Of course, Belgrade is also at the forefront of the attack, which the West wants to additionally neutralize with Kosovo-Albanian hands. With NATO still maintaining a significant presence in Kosovo and tensions between the West and Russia still high amid the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, it can be expected these tensions will continue to boil amid the latest events in the volatile Balkan country. Okay, that's one part of the problem. Let's go to part two. This is going to be, let me see if I have the one here. This is not the argument I want. Give me 1 second here. I want to put this, make sure this isn't behind a friggin' paywall. Of course it is. So, at the same time this is happening, what we are seeing, and I'll put the link here. I'm not going to be able to read the whole thing here, but this has been a major rising problem that may be used as a point of conflict for the Russians. This piece is from the Indian Express, written by Meera Patel, and I think India, actually, the Indian press does a pretty good job of looking in a lot of ways at things that do not get covered in the Western or Eastern press as kind of a third party. Um, Europe's forgotten conflict threatens the survival of Bosnia. As ethnic tensions escalate in the Balkans, Bosnia is at risk of disintegrating, sparking fears that the region may once again descend into conflict, much like it did during the bloody years of the 1990s. And if you were to see this article, which I was able to see, but it got away from me, there is a Republika Srpska, part of eastern Bosnia, that is claiming to be a separatist region that wants to break away. There is, let me see, Serb separatist movement here. Okay, I want to show the name. What are you doing? I have a bird sitting on here. Maybe there was something here. Let's see. Give me 1 second here. I'm just trying to grab this from. No, I don't want to try for free. I don't want to give you my information. Go away.
Can't you open
No.
the incognito tab?
Yeah, I need to do something. I want to make sure I have the right person here. All right, this is from 3 weeks ago, but I want to get the right guy's name. So, Berlin to deploy troops in Bosnia after 10 years after withdrawal. That was reported from Reuters on July 8th. That the Bosnian Serb separatist movement has tacit support from Moscow, that it has grown, and that it doesn't even label them. This is lazy. You know what's interesting? They always put a lot of effort in the media telling you every person who's involved with the side that the West likes, but they never tell you the other way here. Okay, no, do not. All right, can you take the bird? The bird is using me. Just look at my legs. Would you be so kind as to clean that off, or at least give me a napkin? So, all right, this is from. We're gonna do this here. This will give you some background, and you'll have to forgive me. I literally just had a bird take a crap on my legs, so I'm a little distracted. I apologize for that. Not that you wanted to hear that, but the only thing worse than hearing about is me having to feel it. We have a couple birds to help a wounded one up here, and it's just anyway. All right, where were we? I want to read this. This is from StopFake.org, which is fine, but I'm reading it. This is from the conversation. And I want to give you a little bit of detail on the Bosnia situation. We'll jump down, looks like 4 paragraphs in. Bosnia and Herzegovina has a 3-member president made up of 1 member from each of the country's 3 major ethnic groups, the Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats in order of size. The state comprises 2 autonomous entities, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republic Srpska, and a 3rd unit, the Brčko district. Dodik, which his name is Milorad Dodik, who's the Serb member of the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, has supported the creation of the 2 self-declared republics in Ukraine, and he's also behind plans to establish a new Serb army and alliance to a separatist movement that could split Bosnia and Herzegovina in half. Germany just announced it will freeze 120 million euros worth of infrastructure projects in Bosnia's Serb region because of concerns over secessionist policies, and the UK government announced sanctions in April 2022 against Dodik, including a travel ban for undermining the region's stability. Analysts are worried that Dodik's movement could threaten the uneasy peace created after the Balkan War, which ended in 1999. So, here's what we have. The Croats aren't apparently causing a problem, but the Serbs, who are the 2nd largest group in Bosnia, want back into Serbia from the lines that came out of, I guess it was called the Dayton Accords, if I remember right. And so you have a situation now where Serbs are being targeted by Muslims aligned with NATO in Kosovo, that you see Serbs who are being castigated by the European Union because they're standing against the majority Muslim regime in Bosnia, and that the Russians, who are mad with NATO and who are being very friendly to separatist powers, are going to be more likely to stand behind these people. And so we'll go to the final story in today's set, which is from the Moscow Times, to include the Russian response to this situation. And what I'm trying to demonstrate in all this is the powder keg that could go off with one miscalculation. And you know what? And it doesn't have to be even be a state level actor. You have some Serbian militant, or you have some guerrilla person. Let's say you have some Serbian guy rocking some AK-47s who shoots up a bunch of Kosovars and says, we're going to be part of Serbia. Help us, Vladimir Putin. And the Kosovo government locks down these people and says, you will now comply. And Russia says, you're not going to do this. And you can see how this will spiral out of control. And this is how history often turns. When you have these massive machines playing brinksmanship, whether it be China and Taiwan drawing the U.S. in, or whether it be in the Balkans where the U.S. and Russia, or Russia and NATO, if you want to put more broadly, are drawn in, you end up with this situation where one miscalculation, not even by the big actors, but by the people on the ground who have been ginned up to hate one another, and who have legitimate grievances. I'm not here to take sides in it. If I did, I'd probably side with the Serbs in this case. But the point of it is that we are now at a point where things can spiral out of control. And this is from Moscow Times. Russia accuses radical Kosovo of displacing Serbs in border roads. Just the Moscow Times is a American-supported, Western-supported paper that's being funded to speak to the Russians from a Western perspective, but it's easy to read and it's in English, and it'll give you the response from the Russian government, which is all I really want here. Russia has accused radical Kosovo of attempting to displace Serbs from the north of the Balkan country with new border roads that have renewed tensions. And keep this is against the background of what's his name, Sergei Shoigu, saying, we're going to have to reestablish the USSR before this is all over for Russian security. That happened. And if you were to read some of the Russian chats, and I do, they certainly are more than happy to contemplate a larger thing, and why not? They've been banned from everything, even from being able to sell scarves on Etsy. Anyway, Kosovo police closed 2 border crossings with Serbia on Sunday after it took on gunfire and ethnic Serbs blocked roads along the border. Ethnic Serbs, who make up a majority of the population in northern Kosovo, keep in mind this was carved out by NATO, right, were protesting Pristina's requirements for them to retain temporary documents and license plates while visiting Kosovo, a move that Pristina defends as reciprocal to Belgrade's. Kosovo agreed to delay the implementation of the plan for 1 month until September 1st, until after the protest, in talks with EU and U.S. ambassadors. Russia's foreign ministry accused Kosovo of, quote, taking another step toward the expulsion of the Serbian population from Kosovo and the ouster of Kosovo-Serbian institutions that protect the rights of Serbian residents from the arbitrary rule of Pristina radicals. So they obviously don't treat Kosovo as a state. Kosovar leaders know that Serbs will not be indifferent to a direct attack on their freedoms, and they are deliberately aggravating it in order to launch a violent scenario, ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said in a statement late Sunday. So, here's the question. If you accept the idea that NATO wanted Ukraine to drag Russia into a war, on the concept that a larger war with Russia now allows them to avoid a war with China later, because they don't want China and Russia getting connected. Remember, I told you there's going to be a pipeline between China and Russia. If you can remove Russia from the equation, you're isolating China, and BRICS becomes a lot harder to work out, even though those two may be working together, and we may see a war where the West is biting off more than it can chew. Nonetheless, there are people in Washington and London and Tel Aviv that would have the mindset that better to follow the neoconservative vision, pick this war now, and to overextend Russia. So if Ukraine didn't work, maybe Serbia works, and maybe Kosovo and or Bosnia are how you can do it. Anyway, Zakharova said Serbia-Kosovo tensions served as further evidence of the failure of the EU mediation mission. EU-led talks launched in 2011 have so far failed to normalize ties between Belgrade and Pristina. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić said earlier on Sunday that Serbia will win if Serbs are attacked, noting that the atmosphere has been brought to a boil. Kosovo Prime Minister Albin Kurti accused Vučić of igniting unrest and called for the removal of barricades on Monday. And I can guarantee you Vučić is in contact with Putin. That's got to be the case, as much as Kurti is listening to people like Biden and Johnson or whoever is going to be taking over there in the UK. So the rest of it, all right, it's just talking about the history of it. You don't need to know that. We covered that already. All right. So this is the situation. And any of this and all of this could explode at a moment's notice. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on the timetable of some big actor. It could be on the timetable of a smaller one that acts in this way. And we should keep a very close eye on the Balkans, because world wars have started there over less. All it would take is a false flag type attack, an assassination, maybe a legitimate conflict where those Serbs who are stuck living in Kosovo, or conversely, the Kosovars who are stuck living in Serbia, end up fighting one another. And this is a problem. This is why, what happened, as much as it's kind of a weird thing, the only example I can think of sort of preventing these problems is like what the Greeks and Turks did after World War One, where the Greeks moved out of Asia Minor and the Turks moved out of Europe, and that gave relative peace and calm. So everything didn't end up like Cyprus eventually would. So this is the world that's on fire right now, and as we look at it, let me just take a quick look here through my own Telegram group and see if there's anything that I want to share with you that would be even worse about what's happening right now, because I do have a connection to a number of different Russian groups that would say if there was something happening that would be, let's see, they're just talking about Ukraine. Here are the updates that are coming in by Intel Slava, and I specifically include this site. By the way, if you look at Intel Slava Z, it's the main, well, it's one of the main Russian sort of information sources on Telegram. It's got 400,000 subscribers. So let's see what we have here. China releases a show of force video. This is fun. Well, you want to see what the Chinese army puts out here? We'll show you. I'll turn it around. You can watch. We'll watch in real time together. We'll see what the PLA has here. It'll look like a recruitment video. And compare this, by the way, if you want, with the what we do in the West here. So I'm not going to put the volume up because every time I do, you guys tell me how terrible it comes out. And it does come out terrible. But we'll just watch for a minute here and see what the Chinese are showing us they got. And I'll comment over it. So they're showing their ability to fight in various forces of terrain. A lot of ships. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the Chinese military is knocking out like 2 carriers a year as part of their plan to have a blue water fleet here. Now, they don't have a lot of active combat experience. I know a couple of them were going to Afghanistan, and some have been in operations in East Africa, but they really haven't been in the field, so we'll see how well they perform. I don't know what their energy supply ability is as well, but they would probably get a lot of support from Iran moving forward. But this is what they are showing and what they're, and keep in mind, propagandizing their own people. And this is one of the things that a lot of people don't consider. When you get into a situation where you're talking about the need to go to war and the problems that are out there, your own people becomes kind of the tail that wags the dog. Because at some point, if you're told that you have this horrible enemy, that the West is trying to destroy us, for instance, and that we have this great thing, there are going to be a number of people who believe the propaganda so deeply that they will think this is an existential threat and that we need to act very quickly in opposing this. So you see there an example of some of their missile defense imperatives. And this is basically the Chinese idea that given their proximity to Taiwan, they just need to deny access in the area to Western forces. And from what I've read and heard, that if we were even to try to resupply Taiwan for actual resistance, you're looking at something that would take months beyond what is thought to be placed there on the island. And it would be very, very likely, especially since I know it affects at least one member of our audience who's a dear friend to us, any attack that China launched on Taiwan, if there was not a pre-existing understanding that the United States would not be involved, might very likely be coupled with attacks on Okinawa, on, I would imagine, on Guam and potentially other places, thinking specifically of Andersen Air Force Base, the various military camps. I used to know the names of all the ones in Okinawa. And also, Japan has been specifically warned, run Moana, right? Yeah, go seek Tofudi. It's time for you to go follow the waves. It's true. So what you would find in that scenario is that, especially considering the new relationships that China's been seeking in, the Solomon Islands, they may have emplacements in other places. Diego Garcia is one they could target. I don't know if it's as likely because it's in the Indian Ocean, but it's certainly in the possibility there. So let's see here. We have an update, 12 p.m. The Chinese aircraft carrier Shandong left the base in Hainan. That's on their east coast, and departed in an unknown direction. Japan reports high activity of warships of the Chinese Navy. And the Taiwanese Ministry of Defense canceled vacations for military personnel and announced the mobilization of air defense forces to prepare for war. So that's what they're doing in Taiwan right now, and how much you want to put into that is up to you. It is a good moment.
How much stock would you put in our military compared to the Russian and the Chinese military, considering that, you can identify as an Apache helicopter today? And paint your nails pink while you're on the gun range. I mean, like, come on.
The American military
Come on.
has two major problems beyond the terrible woke ideologies. Number one, an over-reliance on special forces for asymmetrical conflict based on the last 20 years of fighting, so we're not prepared for theater-level conflict like the Russians and Chinese are prepared for. Number two
I think
is...
our guys would go running.
Well, number two, well,
or
maybe.
Not all the...
Well, you can't run if you're on an island, but, I mean, swim, I guess.
You could if you really...
So, to all our sailors and airmen out there in Guam, get a boogie board, put a motor on it. Good luck. Watch out for the sharks. Wilson! All right. That's terrible. I don't mean to be making light of it, but maybe I am. But what we're going to see... All right, here we got an update here from literally 1 minute ago from counterintelligence group Telegram. According to Taiwanese media, Pelosi will fly tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, 22:30 local, to Songshan Airport in Taipei, spend the night at the Grand Hyatt Hotel, and in the morning visit the Taiwan Legislative Council, where she will meet with the leadership of the island, including its head, Tsai Ing-wen. So, apparently she's going to meet with the president, which is going to piss the Chinese... She's going to Taiwan. She's going to meet with the president.
Oh, man.
We'll see. That's great. It starts with an earthquake. Thomas James is not afraid. Okay. Anyway.
Oh, man.
How was that? Sneak into... And literally, the Chinese state media is saying they're going to sneak into a Chinese island in the pitch dark night. Pelosi knows she's doing evil things. Well, she does evil things all the time, right? But what I was going to say is, so number one problem is that we're set up for theater-level conflict, or rather asymmetrical conflict in a single campaign rather than theater-level conflict. Number two problem is over-reliance on technology, which may or may not be obsolete. One of the things I'm sure that's been happening a lot in the Ukrainian theater, much like happened in the Spanish Civil War before World War II, is the testing of various weapon systems, like the new, what's the one they sent over there recently? I think it's called HIMARS, which apparently has been quite effective against Russian targets. I mean, I didn't share stories on how Ukraine's going because Western media is pretending the Ukrainians are doing very well. I don't think that's the case at all. There's no evidence to suggest that. It's opium, and you don't need hopium. I'm not going to give you that. I do think that Russia will have to make a decision if they want to advance past the Dnieper, but ultimately, this is the question that's out there. But with respect to America fighting a war against China and or Russia, I do know the strategic doctrines of both countries would look at asymmetrical forces, including the potential use of paramilitaries to include gang members, cartel movements, sleeper agents. One of the stories that's not reported on enough with respect to China is the way in which Chinese residents in the United States, Canada, and other countries are often held hostage by family members back home and are required to do things, provide information, resources back to the government. They don't accept the idea that citizens are individual. If you're Chinese, they intend to use you. And certainly when you look at the reliance that the American politicians had on the drug trade, the inclusion of the cartels in the Chinese triad mafia, the connections between that and the Chinese military, it's easy to see there's a lot of dirt. Going back to the driver, Dianne Feinstein, think of Al Gore, those Buddhist temples back in the day, that certain elements, or Mitch McConnell's wife as another example, that's Taiwanese, but that gets complicated, where the Chinese government, through Confucius Institutes, other state entities, and things like Charles Lieber, we talked about last week, the Harvard bioscientist, we would see deep tendrils into the West. So that what would happen is asymmetrical warfare. If America was at war with China, or China wanted to disrupt America, there are a lot of things they could do, including cyber attacks, including forms of domestic terrorism, including threatening the power grid, that would be quite harmful. And keep in mind, at the same time this happens, it is very possible, and I would say probable, that an attack by China would not be done without consultation with the Russians and as part of a wider war, because Russia already conceives of the war in Ukraine as a war against NATO, and it's very possible their reconsolidation, where they've held back a lot of their crack troops, and they've really been using Ukraine as a training ground rather than advancing as aggressively as they perhaps could, is caught up in this idea that the larger conflict will be required. So if that happens, what should we expect, and what would I think? I think a lot of Americans, to be honest with you, have no desire to stand up for this government. I am one of them for sure as a Pinelander, and that they would struggle and they would try to get people to stand behind them, saying that this is a terrible thing, this is a fight for democracy and all that. But after you've banned a whole bunch of people from an ideological purge based upon their inoculation status, after you've been promoting these transgender ideologies, including purges of the senior ranks going back to the Obama administration, the recruiting nightmare that the U.S. military has been suffering has been very well known. And on the one hand, we sort of look and laugh at this, right? We think, well, yeah, no one should support him. It's terrible. And as a Pinelander, I sort of support it. On the other hand, there are external powers that are terrible for other reasons that are in a lot of ways worse than the United States, like the Chinese, notably. And what if you think they're all part of one global order, which sometimes you can and sometimes you can't, you might look at that one way. But in with respect to what it means for us domestically, in our countries to have given the power over of our militaries as well as our domestic police forces to people who hate the founding stock and decent folk of our countries, that is an incredible strategic liability. And I hope more governors and National Guards begin to realize they may need to serve for the defense of the American people against the overreach of a potentially tyrannical government in Washington that may enable foreign powers to act upon us, that may act directly against us. It's really a very hard and it's a bad situation. So what do? You separate, you get as far away from the trouble as you can. One of the things I've recommended for years is if you move to a state where there's a smaller military presence, including mainly that's people moving out of the west, moving eastward, whether you end up south or you end up here in the heart of Pineland up here in Maine. One of these things you have to consider. So, but if this happens, what I would say is make sure you're stocked up on fuel, stay out of the way, get food. And if it ends up being a really funny situation, if this really escalates, there is the danger of a nuclear escalation and attacks upon, of course, military targets to include bases. Think your big hits will be Hawaii, obviously. I would imagine Anchorage, Fairbanks would be big, Norfolk, Charleston, Pensacola, Houston, Denver, that area, Colorado Springs area, Seattle because of the forts, Kitsap and all the ports up there. San Francisco actually has quite a bit of military infrastructure. And of course, San Diego, Camp Pendleton, Camp Lejeune. You guys know where the major ports are. And you might know the other ones, Fort Hood, Fort Carson, the major military installations, and the Pentagon. Now, do I know it's going to come to all that? No, I don't know. I like to think, I hope the cooler heads will prevail. But if this goes bad, no one's going to back down. That's the problem. So if someone gets shut down, the Taiwanese might back down a little bit. But if Pelosi gets hurt or Chinese gets shut down, China will go to war over that, and America will go to war over Pelosi. So Taiwan might be the victim of something like this, and the West might be all right with that. China might say, we took down Taiwanese to teach them a lesson. Taiwan might say to the world, this is why China's so terrible, and you might see the slow push towards a war that's been going forward. Or they might just choose to do economic things. But I think China, with all their barking, has to at least blow something up for a little bit of strength, even if it's just launching some missiles into some dirt somewhere. So that one worries me more in the short term. That's how they think.
I'm just laughing at it.
You like that?
It's funny.
It is funny. And it's sad. The other thing that I wanted to share with you was that with the Serbia situation, that's one of those where it feels more like a slow boil. But those things in the Balkans, those people are hot-tempered, and they nurse their historical grievances. I've been informed about how bad it is down there. I have a friend who's a Croat, not by birth, but who lives down there, who shared some information with me. Shout out to my friend out there. He knows who he is. Things get bad there fast. And if they do, sides will be taken, and then we're in a conflict. And then once we're in a conflict, the thing about it is, if you take the broad perspective, what we've been talking about, transhumanism, the technology, the global elites above that, maybe they erase a lot of these governments and then put in a single system. Say, we don't have money, we don't have food, so we all get a certain amount, we're all going to start over. Bunch of people dead, and then the survivors will have to deal with the aftermath. But a lot of those people will not be the victims of this. And I'm just saying the people who get you into trouble should not be the ones you trust to get you out of trouble. And whatever deals they offer, you're better off not taking it and resisting them. So that's what I think we're going to see in the days ahead. We'll keep a close eye on this, and if something goes hot, if we do get ourselves into a war, because we all know I'm a media junkie, and we know you guys have nowhere better to go, what we'll do maybe is we'll do some live coverage of things in terms of the political fallout, in terms of coverage. If something major happens in Taiwan, do feel free to come back to Pinelanders. We will be sharing that, and we will be doing ongoing updates, commentary on this and other topics as makes sense through the Pinelanders group over on Telegram, t.me/Atlantic Homeland. We certainly would love to have more people come up this way, but for those of you wherever you live, the United States, North America, and beyond, you're certainly welcome to join us, and we appreciate all of you. In closing, I just want to say it's great to be back with you. I missed being able to share the information with you. It's a big part of our day. It's a big part of our life that we do every week. We commit to 5 to 10 hours of coverage, which means usually 10 to 20 hours of preparation. It's a lot of work to put a show together with this level of detail. Our audience always tells me how much they enjoy listening to the program while they're doing other things, because you get in-depth analysis, you get historical perspective, you get a Christian background on things that from a realist perspective that doesn't happen a lot in too many places, and you get a well-developed articulate argument that explains well what's happening in the world and why it's happening, not behind the guise of ideology or any sort of faux nationalism, but about the motives and psychological motivations upon which our world operates. It's our pleasure and our honor to share that with you, and we just ask that if you find value in the program, please consider and continue supporting us. If your means allow and you can provide, we historically have asked people to consider doing $25 a month if you do nothing less. Just because that, if you think of it for like $1 a day, it gives me the time to not have to do other things, so I can devote the time to this, because there are trade-offs involved and things are becoming more pricey, and I know all of us are dealing with that. So I want to thank those of you who support us through the Venmo, CVC, PRV. Maybe you choose to do it by buying a book. That works just as well for me. We get something from that P.O. Box. I would go on Amazon. P.O. Box 343, Eagle Lake, Maine 04739. Yeah, it's okay. Milt, we should do a show soon here on China. You get in touch with me. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I got the Lord Tom 1 shirt on here. I'm wearing the shirt with the crown. I've had this shirt for a while now. I think I had the shirt going all the way back to Pittsburgh, actually, and it still fits me.
All of your shirts have holes.
All of my rooms have chickens.
All of your shirts have
No,
holes.
and we use these for good purposes. So if you can support the program, that would be absolutely awesome, very helpful. And for the other people, we're glad you're here. I know a lot of people aren't in a position to be able to do that. I understand that. We'll try to do what we can. You're always going to get some content, but hey, the more you help, the more I can do, and the more I can do, the better it'll be. And, I'm hopeful. I always hope that, we have the talent to put together a wider view of programs. We got people like Milt, and we got that guy, and we got my boy Pirate James, and there's people we could actually put together a full network of content where I think you'd have a lot of different voices. We just need some technical support who could do this. Maybe if I can convince Ben to stop wandering the land and come join us up here. He himself makes for a great host, actually, as well. Very smart man. A lot of stuff he knows that a lot of people don't know. You guys would benefit from the wisdom of that, and I hope we can do that in the future. Plus, it would give us the benefit of what we want to accomplish with Pineland, which is really, here we're trying to build a community based in truth. We start with biblical truth. We look at truth in the world, and we try to share information so that you really understand what's happening in its full depth. And when we don't have it exactly right, we look at the foundations, we predict how things are going to play out, and we usually manage to be quite a few steps ahead. We're very good at tracking news. We look at multiple sources from multiple perspectives, and we include also, I want to thank Dana. She gives you the practical, on-the-ground female view of a lot of things on a lot of issues where we don't necessarily get that. I also want to, as a final thing, invite you to join us for ministry on Sundays. What you begin to realize when you do this longer is that there are deeper complexions to this, is the spiritual warfare that's ongoing. Part of why I do the ministry work is for that. We have to find what we're going to stand on, because the world, the things we trusted before, I think most of you know, every major institution within our countries, and definitely at the global level, will betray the interests of the common citizen, especially if you're of a nationalist or a traditionalist or just a basic human liberty, your decency perspective. The state is at war with you, and it's been at war with you for a very long time. So we'll look at that, and like we did the last week before I got shut down, you're going to see in the days ahead a renewed focus on technology being pushed against us. I am personally increasingly involved with efforts internationally to try to resist the imposition of a global credit score system, which we have reason to believe the predictable outcome in the problem reaction solution scenario of the forced austerity by the dysgenic policies of governments masquerading as COVID protection and climate change will lead to mass suffering, mass death, and the difficulties from this will be used to justify the imposition of a system of forced austerity. upon people that will be branded as sustainability and equality that will hurt not just people at the bottom. In fact, it will lift up some people at the very bottom slightly, although placing them under a totalitarian agenda. At the same time, it's going to bring down the middle and upper class from the ability to threaten the elites, who will be hiding behind the scenes, as they often do. Will be given a Soros as, a sacrificial martyr, as red meat on blood on the altar of the creation of this new regime. And when you look at the war that is being promised, you look at if you guys who have studied this longer, you know who I'm talking about, people like Albert Pike, you're talking about this agenda has been floating around for 100 years that you need a really big war to justify the creation of a global solution, so that it really is like World War I was promised to be, the war to end all wars, so that new power can come to the fore. And I can pretty much assure you that power will not have your interest if it is a universal human governance structure based on technology promising to meet the needs of everyone by creating us on an equal standard. You can call that communism, you can call it totalitarianism. I call it the Antichrist, but you call it what you will. What we will be doing as Pinelanders is we'll be watching for this and warning you how the pieces are in play to realize these visions. Because whether you look at it from the Christian perspective of seeing it as the culminating battle of evil against good to take away man's ability to express his soul and his right of worship and the basic liberty that is our natural right, or whether you see it from a more secular perspective of understanding that this is communism at the global level, a 9 years war, as Ben says, that you're going to see that this model is going to be imposed upon us. You see it being beta tested in Israel. Watch what's happening in Sri Lanka, where the government was overthrown by the people, and yet a more oppressive regime is being put in with mandatory fuel credits and food credits, which people are accepting because they didn't want to starve. But do you think they're ever going to get out from underneath that system once it's in place, especially if there is punishment and reward structures for people who stand outside the system and those who report them? We've already seen that beta tested here with the COVID lockdowns. Expect that to be a feature of what's coming in the future. And if we are thinking ahead, there will be a very narrow window, if any, where we can offer meaningful resistance to this before we find most of the population weaponized in the course of survival and conformity against the people. And people do understand this. The networking of this group is amazing. We have conversations. We talk to people who are trying to do things. But the reality is most people are not going to awaken. They don't care. They're going to follow the path of least resistance. And so the future is going to demand a lot more of you. This channel honors you by treating you as adults and sharing that information with you. Hopefully you enjoy that. You find value to it. If you do, while it still has value, help a brother out. You know what I mean? We appreciate it, and it means a lot to us. Other than that, the most important thing, of course, as always, is your prayers. I just want to say God bless each of you. I hope you're having a great afternoon. Thank you for supporting the program. For my family to yours, God bless from Pineland. I'm Tom Kaczynski, speaking for Dana. Pinelander, out.